Would you like to add a nice transition between your rooms? One that comes from either the side or the top or even diagonal? Well, keep watching and I'll show you how. G'day gamers, and welcome to our transition tutorial. What I'm going to show you how to do is create this nice transition that'll allow you to move between your rooms. Now this is a horizontal example, but there are cases where you can use a vertical one, and you can also change the shape so you can use a different sprite and have a circular transition as well. Now I'm going to demonstrate how to do the horizontal one, and I'll talk about these diagonal and the vertical one at the end of the tutorial. So the first thing I want to do is go and create an object. I'm going to create an OGame object, and that's something I create in all my projects. It just lets you use that to manage all the other objects. In this case, I'm going to make it persistent so that it exists between rooms, and I'm going to add a step event which we can use to play the animation. So I'm just going to add a keyboard press here, and we're going to capture just a key. I'm going to just capture the H key, and that's what I'm going to use to play the transition. So you could put this kind of thing in a collision event or however you want to call the transition. So firstly, we're going to check if the instance exists of the transition, and it's going to be called O transition. And if it doesn't exist, we want to create it. So instance create. It's going to create a layer at X, Y under the instances layer, and it's going to be called O transition. Now, obviously this doesn't exist yet. We're just going to go and create that in a moment. Now I'm also going to add a key pressed event for the letter R, and that'll just be a game restart. And this is just basically so we can test it a few times at the same time. Now, being that this is a persistent object, I'm going to create an object that will create this one. So when we come back to the first room, it doesn't continue to get created. And all I want to do is have here, if the instance doesn't exist of OGame, then we want to create it. And what we can do is place that in the room, and that we'll just call it O_init, and we'll just place that in the room so that it will create our OGame instance, and it only gets created once that way. Now, so that we can test between rooms, I'm going to go to the background of this room and just choose a color. I'm going to make it, let's say, blue. And then what we can do is duplicate that room. So for our room 1, and we just want to make sure this one's different, so we'll just change the background. I'm going to just change it to an orange color. So lastly, we just want to go to instances and just delete that initialization instance. We don't need it in the second room because it does get created in the first room. So once that initialization object is created, it'll create OGame, and OGame is persistent, so it'll be persistent between both rooms. Okay, so that's our setup. So let's go and create our transition object now. So it's just called O transition. And let's add a create event for it. So in here, we can set up the sprite that we're going to use for the transition. I'm just going to set it to a variable. It's going to be called SPR, and we can set that as the sprite name. So we're going to use s_trans_sq for square. This is going to be the name of the sprite. Let's go and create that first. So if we right click on sprites and go to create, we'll use the name. And if you look in the description, I've added this sprite so you don't have to create it yourself. So you should be able to just save that and drag it in, and you'll see it's just a simple animation. Now I'm going to set the speed at 40, and we can close that down. Now I'll go back to the transition, and there's our sprite object. Now we're going to get some information about that. Firstly, I'm going to get the width of it and store it in a variable. And then we're also going to get the height. So I can grab it like that. I can Control D on a line to duplicate it. Now I'm going to get the number of sprites required for the width of our room. And let's do the X first. So set max sprites for X. And I'm going to store that in a variable called X max. So we're going to look at the room width. And we're going to div that with the sprite width. And what that will do is tell us how many sprites across we need to cover the whole room width. Now we can do the same thing for the Y. So I'm going to set the Y, and we're going to look at the room height, and it's going to be our Y max. Just note that if you're using a camera and your room dimensions are bigger than the view, you're going to want to use the display-git GUI width and height functions instead of the room width and height values. So when we draw the sprite, normally the image index increments, and that's how the sprite animation plays. But because we're going to be just drawing the sprite, we need to manage the image index ourselves. So I'm going to set up the image speed here, and we're just going to manage it by having an increment value, and we're going to add that to our image index value. I'm just going to call it sub image index increment. And this is how fast we're going to play the sprite. And we can get the speed of the sprite by saying sprite get speed of our sprite. And we can divide it by the room speed, which will tell us the step increment. And that's how much we have to increment the index per step to make it play. So our sub image index is just 0, and that's just the image index we're on, and we'll just increment it by this value per step, and that will play the animation at the frame rate that we've chosen. Now lastly, I'm going to set up a transition color. Now this can be anything that you want. I'm just setting mine to C black, but you can have any color there, and it'll change based on that. And that's why I've made the sprite white, so that you can have a set color here and use the blending mode of the draw function to then change the color. Okay, so let's set up the increment here. So I'm going to go to add event, go to step. What we can do here is increment our image index. So our sub image index plus equals sub image index increment. So that'll increase the image index. Now let's draw our sprites to the screen. So I'm going to put it in a draw GUI event, because when you do a transition, you would most likely want the transition to be over top of everything else. So if you add it to a GUI event, you can be sure that this will be drawn over top of everything else. And if you have other GUI elements, you'll need to place this on a layer that is above all of those other elements. But now that we want to draw the sprite, you can imagine that this is the room we're trying to draw, and our sprite only takes up a small section of it. We want to draw iterations of it at each X position across, and also at the Y positions down, and that way we'll fill the screen. So we'll need to do 2 loops for this. So we're going to do 2 for loops. So I can press F4 and then 5 to get a shortcut to a for loop. And this is going to be for our Y. So I'm going to call it YY. And we want to make sure our condition is YY is less than or equal to our Y max. And that's the maximum amount of sprites we can fit for our room height. And we want to just duplicate that, and this time we want to add for the X. So this is XX, and our Y max is going to be X max. But now this will loop through all of those positions in the room. And we can just draw the sprite here, but we can use the looping function to ensure that we get our sprite at every position or grid position in the room. So we want to draw our SPR. We want to draw our sub image index. We want to draw it at our XX times our sprite width, because this is incrementing based on how many sprites we can fit across. So if we times it by the width of the sprite, we'll get it drawn at the correct location. And the same for the Y, YY times sprite height. Now the scale is just 1. We're doing 1 for our Y, 0 rotation. Our color is going to be our COL, and our alpha is just 1. So let's test this out, and we should find that we're getting our sprite drawn on the top of the room. So now when we press H, we should get our animation playing. Now we have the animation playing, but since the image index is getting incremented continuously, it just plays the animation. We need to limit that to play once only, and also only play them in sequence. so they're played from the left to the right. So let's add a variable that we can set to be the maximum frames in our sprite. So back on the create event, let's go down and let's add an I max, and that's our index maximum. And we can just get the sprite number, so sprite get number of our SPR, and that'll be the maximum frames in our sprite. Now we can ensure we only increment if we are below that. So here, let's do a check and say if our sub image index is less than our I max, then we can increment the index. Let's test that again. Now when we press, okay, so that plays correctly, but what we need to do, if I press R and press H again, so we get it playing, but we don't get it playing in sequence. So in order to have it going from the left to the right, what we can do is go into our draw GUI, and right here, if we minus XX, so if we take off XX so that we play it from the left to the right, if I run that now, we'll see that it actually plays in sequence. And it doesn't play too many times, but if I press R and show it again, you'll see it does move across, but a few things are happening. Firstly, it's playing very fast, and we're also getting it playing over here. We don't want it playing here, but what's happening is because we're minusing XX to get it to, in order to play as a sequence, this value of subimage index minus XX is going below 0. And because it's going below 0, it's looping back and playing other frames. So we want to make sure that this doesn't go below 0. And we can do that by saying max of 0 or image index minus XX. So now what will happen is we'll only get the maximum value of this being greater than 0 or 0. So we won't ever have a value that's a negative. So if we play that again, and now we get it coming across. Now what's happening though, it's playing, but it's stopping right here. It's not playing the whole distance. So our check for image index incrementing should not be here, it should be when it's over here. And this distance is X max. So in the step event, we can say that we want to make sure it plays if it's less than I max plus X max. So it's bigger than the increment and it's bigger than the length of the screen. So now when I play it, if you notice we get the initial frames, you'll see them go very quickly. There they are. So even though we get those initial frames playing correctly, the ones after, which should be black, continue to play. And that's because they are bigger than our IMAX value, which means they loop over and play. So if IMAX, our maximum frames, is 10, and we want image index 11 to show, it will show the first frame. The image index value just loops over and starts again. So we need to ensure if our value is larger than IMAX, we just set it to the last frame instead, which is this full black sprite. So let's just do that. But we don't want it to be bigger than IMAX minus 1. So we're going to add a minimum here and say that we want to choose the minimum of this, of all of this, or IMAX minus 1. And that will stop it being larger than IMAX minus 1. So let's test that again. And there we go. So if I press R to restart, we'll see it flies along and then we're drawn the last frame. Now we need to move to the new room and reverse the animation to fade us into the new room. So we can add an else which will take us to the new room once we've played the initial animation. Also, to make it more flexible, we can add a target room variable. So you can use this to move to any room at all. So just here we can say else, and here we want to go to room. So if our room exists of target room, and you should check this to make sure we're passing a valid room, then we go room, go to target room. So let's create this target room variable. So do that down here. And I'll just set it to no one for the moment. Now back in our OGame, where we are creating the instance, let's create it and set it to a variable that then we can access. And we can just say, if the room we are in at the moment equals room 0, then inst.target room equals room 1. Else inst.target room equals room 0. And that'll just ping pong us back and forth between room 1 and room 0, just for testing purposes. Obviously, when you implement this in your game, you can just add whatever target room you want, and it will then move to that particular room. So let's test that out. So now when I press H, we move and we're instantly moved to the second room. And I can press it again and I'll go back to the first room, and we can just move back and forth like that. Now we need to change this, because once that plays, we need to then play the transition in reverse while still drawing the last frame on the screen. So we still want this to be drawn black. So once we transition once, we still want it to be black, and then we want it to transition this way. So we need our transition object to be persistent as well, so it's not destroyed when the room changes. So let's go to our transition object, let's make it persistent. And now we want to create a simple state machine that'll manage the in and out transition, so it's a bit easier to see which way we're moving. So in the create event here, I'm just going to create a simple state machine. Now I'm not going to go too much into what this is, because I do cover this in some of my other tutorials, but basically enums are just words where that GameMaker interprets as numbers. So I'm going to create a state machine, and we're going to use the enum variables in and out, indicating that we're transitioning in and out of the room. And we'll just set a variable called state, and we'll set state to be states.out, because that's our initial transition. We're going out of the room, and then we'll go in to come into the room for the fade in. Now in our step event, let's just create a simple switch statement here that will look at our state, and this will be our states.out, and that. And then we'll just have a break here, and we'll do our states.in. Now once our transition plays, we can change our state, and we'll say states.in at that point. And therefore we'll move to the in state, and we can fade in. So here we want to do another check. We want to do it in reverse. We want to say if our sub image index is greater than 0, then we want to decrease it. So sub image index minus equals sub image index increment. So once the transition's played completely and we no longer have any image index values to show, we can just destroy this object. And that just means at the end of the transition, we will destroy this object. So let's press play and test that out. And now we transition in and then out. And you can jump back and forth between rooms just with the way that I've set it up here, but you could do a similar thing for your game. And that's basically all there is to it. Now you could do something like change the sprite, and you can have a circle like this one. You can also show it from the top, the bottom, and also from diagonal positions. Now I'm going to add these extra transitions as a Patreon only bonus. So if you're a Patreon, you can view the posts over there on the site showing how to add these extra special effects. Speaking of Patreons, these are the legendary Patreons I'd like to thank this month. Being a legendary supporter allows you free access to my Udemy course, as well as other benefits. Dylan Jackson, Fox and Raven Ent, Kaiser Ho, and Michael. Their continued support allows me to produce content for you guys. Thanks as well to these epic supporters, I appreciate their generosity. Skydevil Palm, Sheldon ENTP, Salvatore Capolino, Claypot, and Dan Half. Lastly, these rare supporters also generously offer their support, which I very much appreciate. Finally, if you want to learn more about GameMaker, I have a Udemy course which steps you through the process of making a complete game in GML. There's a coupon code in the description which gives you 90% off the retail price. If that's something you're interested in, give it a try because the course has a 30-day money-back guarantee, so you have nothing to lose. That's all for this one. Thanks for joining me. I'll talk to you in the next one.